Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Free Enterprise, An American History by Lawrence B. Glickman, narrated by Rick Adamson. Introduction. A great many of our American people talk lovingly of what they call the free enterprise system. Began a 5-part series of editorials in the Des Moines Register in February and March 1940. They insist that they want it preserved. They make devotion to it the acid test of Americanism itself. They revere it. They virtually worship it. They make it sort of a god. Although the editorial emphasized that free enterprise was an authentic American religion revered with devotion and worshipped like a god, the editorialist's quizzical rather than celebratory tone, as well as the reiteration of fidelity to the system, like the overwrought protestations of a doubting parishioner, worked to undermine rather than reinforce the professed faith in free enterprise that supposedly lay deep in the American psyche and soul. The editorials described that system as freedom for business firms, which was best promoted when government takes its hands off. The opposite of free enterprise was regimentation, which portended that freedom of other kinds will go with very little lag. Less a set of positive ideas than a negative imperative, the practice of free enterprise amounted to resisting the onslaughts on American freedom, as Ogden Mills, the Secretary of the Treasury under Herbert Hoover, claimed in 1936. It was a preventive impulse, a protector of freedom not by virtue of what it did, but because of what it opposed. The second editorial in the Register's series claimed, "We can best understand the free enterprise system if we approach it historically." That is the task of this book, to interpret this apparently straightforward but perplexing term that has been deemed central to the American experience, but has rarely been treated as a historical phenomenon. While this is probably not the book devoted to the theme of the beneficent purpose of our free enterprise system that the anti-New Dealer Samuel B. Pettengill wished for in 1940, it explores at length his widely shared view that free enterprise was an essential American ideal. It also examines his fear, generally embraced by free enterprise advocates, that under the New Deal, your freedom is being stolen from you right under your eyes, and that free enterprise was a vital resource in the battle to restore that pilfered liberty. An American Myth. When I began this study of the free enterprise system as an American myth, I thought that the term free enterprise, which I mistakenly understood to be roughly synonymous to free market, was false as a description of the American economy and its relationship to the government. I believed that it perpetuated what the historian Oscar Handlin had discovered in the 1940s, that the idea of the United States as a laissez-faire society was a misconception, even though it could be found not only in the pretty publications of the National Association of Manufacturers, where it might be expected, but also in the serious works of our most careful scholars, into which it obtrudes almost automatically. I believe I was correct in assuming that glib mythologies of free enterprise were an inaccurate depiction of the nature of American economic development, which has always been a product of a combination of government and the private sector, or as it came to be known, the mixed economy. Celebrants of free enterprise seemed like hypocrites or prevaricators. However, I discovered that the idea of free enterprise is also a myth in another, more important sense, a set of assumptions, narratives, and attitudes that has guided our common sense and, regardless of empirical accuracy, has dramatically shaped how Americans have understood and engaged in politics. In what Henry Hazlitt, the Newsweek economics columnist, called in 1949 the ideological war for free enterprise, the creation of guiding narratives was pivotal. To take one example, free enterprisers developed a populist language in which they described prerogatives of the business firm as a source of individual freedom. Talk to the average man, and he'll tell you free enterprise means the right of corporate enterprises to make profits, declared a 1944 advertisement for Baltimore's First National Bank. Speaking on behalf of the average man and identifying his interests with banks and other businesses and against the government crucially shaped the political landscape of the 20th century and beyond. Free enterprise advocates invoked myth in still another way when they described it as a custom. Those who from the 1920s through the 1970s reinvented the phrase and gave it an entirely new meaning as an anti-New Deal slogan almost immediately portrayed it as an old-fashioned verity. They referred to it as the traditional American free enterprise system and called it the realization of the hopes and aims and aspirations of man as far back as we have recorded history. Converting a 19th century term with fluid and clashing connotations into an age-old custom required retroactively reading a new conception of the term into the past, thus denying the right of others to claim it in the present. Free enterprise, according to Ogden Mills, stood for the maintenance of our economic and political system as it developed over a century and a half of amazing progress. Like other opponents of the New Deal, Mills feared that attacks on free enterprise, the light that guided Western civilization for over 100 years, would lead to civilizational collapse. Finally, myth inoculated against incorrect predictions. Most of the disasters predicted by free enterprisers failed to materialize. The Social Security Act did not destroy the free enterprise system in the 1930s, as opponents claimed it would. But the power of the discourse did not inhere in its predictive capacity or its truth claims, but in its repetitious familiarity. Believers treated it as a secular religion requiring and rewarding faith. Political defeat only emboldened them to call for what the Republican Indiana Senator Raymond E. Willis termed in 1943 a rebirth of faith in our philosophy of free enterprise that was necessary to combat the future possibility of statist tyranny. In 1977, Ronald Reagan, the once and future Republican presidential candidate, argued that the free enterprise system has never failed us once. On the contrary, we have failed the system, usually by lacking faith in it. Like other faith-based doctrines, it could be maddeningly opaque or unpersuasive to its critics. Yet the merger of faith with myth proved enduring and powerful. The commonly used phrase free enterprise system, first coined in 1924, system of free enterprise was first used in 1919, suggested a capaciousness of meaning. Just as advocates of the free labor system of the 19th century took it to be the building block of a democratic and prosperous society, those who spoke of free enterprise conceived of it as a complete civilizational ecosystem. The word system suggested both that free enterprise comprised an organic whole and that it was incompatible with other systems. It was also a language of naturalization. Advocates treated free enterprise as a self-governing force endangered most of all by artificial efforts, such as state intervention, to interfere with it. Believers in this idea suspected that, no matter how benign, efforts to reform the system would have dangerous consequences. Throughout this period, the advocates of free enterprise treated proposed modifications, even seemingly minor ones, as an assault on the free enterprise system. Advocates of free enterprise thus emerged as jealous protectors of a system that they viewed as both uniquely powerful and perpetually vulnerable. The tone that followed from this view, fearful, aggrieved, even apocalyptic, became as central to free enterprise thought as did the substance of its proponents' ideas, and the psychology of what I call elite victimization shaped the nature of American conservatism. Free enterprise has long been a part of the American political vocabulary. It played a central role in the defining clash in the 19th century between the free labor system, with which it was paired, and the system of chattel slavery. In the 20th century, it served as a key concept in the war between the New Deal and its enemies. Free enterprisers took their agenda to be a necessary moral crusade. The first set of debates, rooted in the 19th century, morphed into the second set in the 20th and came to shape modern political culture. Far from being merely economic disputes, these were fundamental debates over the meaning of morality, society, and politics. Just as free laborites believed that the nation could not endure being half slaveholding and half free, 20th century free enterprisers drew a similar conclusion about the dangers of a mixed economy in which government and private business worked together. Starting in the 1920s, through capitalism's ups and downs, advocates of free enterprise focused on a compelling set of fears about the dangers of government power. This metamorphosis was largely the work of an energetic group of politicians, business leaders, lobbyists, pundits, and leaders of trade organizations. As one proponent said in 1941, the story of free enterprise in America should be told and retold. This book tells how one version of that story became dominant and how this narrative constrained and transformed politics in the United States, even during the height of the period from the 1930s to the 1970s that historians call the New Deal order, when it appeared to be on the losing side of history. Long after Franklin Roosevelt's death, this vocabulary endured as the linchpin in the battle against the welfare state, the Great Society, and eventually post-war liberalism itself. In its most important 20th century incarnation, then, the free enterprise became a mirror of the New Deal, and the clash between the two is a leitmotif shaping every chapter of this book. The free enterprise backlash against the New Deal occurred almost immediately and continued unabated for many decades. Long after Roosevelt was gone, free enterprisers drew repeatedly on the lessons of their attempt to undo his legacy. They reduced almost every political debate to this defining binary. Free enterprisers provided the template for the party of opposition to the threat of the New Deal that Pettengill demanded in 1944. Eventually, the Republican Party became that party of opposition, but initially, many free enterprisers were, like Pettengill, disgruntled Democrats. In this process, free enterprise discourse served as a bridge, providing a home for New Deal critics, many of whom remained in the Democratic Party for decades before the slow process of political realignment sorted conservatives into the Republican Party. Free enterprisers fought a New Deal that existed largely in their imaginations. The actual New Deal, however radical, was also racially exclusive, ideologically promiscuous, and, at least by some measures, over well before the end of Franklin Roosevelt's second term in office. Yet free enterprisers assigned it both ideological coherence and supernatural power. They treated it not as it actually existed, but as the most dangerous American vector of a global movement toward collectivism that was bound to metamorphose into totalitarianism. Similarly, the free enterprise system was an abstraction. Its supporters saw it as all-encompassing, but they variously singled out the corporation, the small business firm, and the lightly regulated market itself as the essence of the system. Although they often represented or championed business interests, free enterprisers rarely acknowledged a partisan perspective or even a self-interested economic standpoint. They spoke instead in the name of ideals such as freedom, and they believed that the promotion of business interests, as they understood them, would best promote individual liberty. In a parallel fashion, the free enterprise critique of statism did not extend to all or even most functions of the government. Free enterprise advocates especially disliked what came to be called the welfare state, the government's powers of redistribution, taxation, and spending on social programs. Yet they distinguished free enterprise from laissez-faire and were not averse to employing the state to promote their interests and to punish those they opposed. Free enterprise supporters of segregation, for example, wanted the government to enforce Jim Crow, claiming it was a dereliction of duty not to do so. Similarly, business-free enterprisers fought hard to promote legislation that made certain forms of union activity illegal. Those who embraced free enterprise then put the New Deal and statism to ideological use. As Bruce Blyven, the editor of the New Republic, noted in 1943, those who want free enterprise are glad to have government interference when it works in their direction. Who's killing free enterprise? My interest in the topic of free enterprise began with a conundrum, a gaping chasm between primary and secondary sources. Whereas users of the term recognized its malleability, scholars have generally taken its meaning for granted. In the 19th century, Americans invoked the phrase for a variety of purposes, usually to signify the importance of the government unleashing the free enterprise of our citizens, as President Andrew Jackson said in his President's Message of 1832, a meaning distinct from the dominant modern one in which business interests take precedence over the state. Evidence abounds that throughout the 20th century, advocates of free enterprise recognized the phrase to be as vague as it is generic, debated its meaning vigorously, expressed frustration at their inability to disseminate it, and even periodically sought to replace it with a more easily understood term. There are few words that have so many different interpretations as free enterprise, wrote one of the phrase's biggest champions, the conservative publisher Raymond C. Hoyles, in 1947. In 1958, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce even spearheaded a program to help clarify the phrase, and the inability of the business community to define the term and to effectively sell the phrase set off periodic waves of confusion and panic from the 1930s to the 1970s. In the end, as the Des Moines Register editorialist suggested, one dominant meaning for free enterprise proved triumphant: the autonomy of the business firm free from government restriction. Free enterprise advocates treated business freedom and power as a precondition for individual liberty and a defense against the ever-present danger of statism. In 1938, Glenn Frank, a rising star in the GOP, described free enterprise as the right of business to act without restraint, depending on its own good judgment. Although he, like most proponents of this new conception of the term, conceded that the government should provide what he called decent economic traffic laws, the essence of free enterprise was, in the final analysis, the autonomy of the business firm, which meant freedom from government dictation. Strong business and compliant, though not necessarily weak or small government, spelled the formula for economic and political liberty by preventing the modern version of slavery, whose most likely cause was overly powerful government. From the start of the New Deal, free enterprise advocates feared that the supposedly sturdy tradition was under threat. They worried that, as a group of bankers claimed in 1940, the country was moving away from the system of free enterprise. The story of dispossession was endlessly retold. It went like this: in the past, we had complete free enterprise, but in the present, it is being undermined and faces the danger of disappearing altogether, along with the freedom that it underwrites. It did not matter when the present was. During the period between the 1930s and 1970s, advocates described the free enterprise system as perpetually under siege. The theme of Wendell Willkie's presidential campaign of 1940 was that the New Deal was killing free enterprise. Advocates interpreted even seemingly benign extensions of the state as mechanisms designed to destroy free enterprise. Lou R. Maxon, the head of the eponymous advertising agency, said in 1943 at the meeting of the Sales Executive Club that grade labeling of canned goods marked the first step in the eventual destruction of the American system of free enterprise by government standardization and regimentation. 1 year later, James J. Davis, Republican senator from Pennsylvania, argued that the New Deal had stripped America almost entirely of free enterprise. The theme was so popular that "Who's Killing Free Enterprise" was the discussion topic for a meeting of the Illini Toastmasters in 1949. Throughout the era of the widespread invocation of the free enterprise system, its champions perceived it as being on the brink of collapse. Although many commentators accused free enterprisers of crying wolf, the declarations of war continued unabated. As early as 1948, columnist James Marlowe urged Americans not to be kidded into getting excited every time you hear someone scream that free enterprise is in danger of being destroyed, advice that Marlowe himself sometimes disregarded. Free enterprisers did not heed such warnings, nor could they, given the degree to which predictions of imminent threat imbued their favored phrase with meaning. In 1962, Donald I. Rogers, the author of The End of Free Enterprise, claimed that we are now in imminent danger of losing the system that once lost would be irretrievable. Champions of free enterprise as the rock upon which the United States stood specialized in mourning its imminent disappearance and in calling, as the National Association of Manufacturers, NAM, did in 1940, for a crusade to save the indispensable system that was the base and bulwark of all the freedoms of the common people. They described such crusades as necessary and desperate responses to the unfair attacks that they discerned all around them. The principle of free enterprise is under constant attack, proclaimed the trade journal The American Builder in 1954. What are you doing to fight back? Although what we might call the age of free enterprise, the era when the phrase was in near constant use as a foil to the New Deal, coincided almost precisely with the Cold War battle against Soviet communism, proponents described the dire threats to the system as primarily domestic, not foreign. Free enterprisers imagined the mechanism of subversion as the slippery slope of social reform, not the bloody revolution or the violent military coup. New Deal liberalism, they believed, had laid the groundwork for socialist totalitarianism. As one critic said of the 1936 Republican presidential candidate, Alf Landon saw a salam to Stalin in every New Deal act or utterance. Advocates of free enterprise took the process by which a welfare state became a police state to be unstoppable, which lent the battle against even minimal additions to the safety net the flavor of existential warfare. Free enterprisers refused to distinguish liberal New Dealers from socialists and other radicals. Since, in her free enterprise teleology, New Deal liberalism was fated to become totalitarianism, the conservative commentator Ruth Alexander, like many of her peers, felt obliged to use the terms welfare state and socialism interchangeably. Not everyone went as far as E.F. Schouten, a vice president of Maytag, who wrote in 1964, "There is no essential difference between an absolute monarchy, a dictatorship, a fascist form of government, and a welfare state." But free enterprisers described the choice as binary and claimed that reforms, no matter how mild, could have devastating consequences. Indeed, they questioned the very idea of liberal reform, labeling it as an illusory category fated by the slippery slope process they took to be inevitable to transform into some version of statist tyranny. Once introduced in the late 1920s, the new version of free enterprise discourse hung in a kind of suspended animation. The dominant rhetorical patterns and even specific language that first appeared at that time changed little over the next 50 years. In 1940, Wendell Willkie said that it was 5 minutes to midnight for free enterprise as the nation sank into a totalitarian pit. 38 years later, Ronald Reagan, aspiring for the presidency he would gain in 2 years, worried that the Democrats had led us down the road of collectivism and fretted that it is 5 minutes till midnight for this wonderful, unique free enterprise system of ours. In the free enterprise discourse that reigned from the 1930s through the 1970s, time literally stood still, although Ruth Alexander set the alarmist clock forward in 1952 to past midnight. Central to free enterprise ideology was the view that the present moment represented a last stand. Walter Trohan's dramatic description of the American institution of free enterprise standing wounded and bleeding with its back to the wall in a life-or-death struggle with collectivism was echoed 2 decades before the Chicago Tribune published these particular words in 1952 and for many years afterward. But redundancy had its costs. As early as 1949, journalist and sociologist Daniel Bell complained that the phrase free enterprise had become a cliché, frayed in its dull repetitiveness. Many understood what Bell took to be a defect as a virtue. Werner Gulander, the new president of the National Association of Manufacturers, reflecting on his long career in a 1963 speech to the Public Relations Society of America, confessed that he had been concerned about threats, challenges, and, yes, inroads on our free enterprise since his time as a management trainee more than 30 years earlier. He reminded his audience that this pretty well coincides with the initiation of the New Deal. Although that episode in political history had passed, his priorities had not changed, and he remained, he said, still concerned about a challenge to free enterprise. Among advocates, Gulander was in the majority in believing that repetition of the free enterprise mantra was a necessary bulwark against the dangers that the New Deal and its successor regimes represented. Using language born in the crisis of the 1930s and World War II, free enterprisers cultivated the perception of emergency. As early as 1938, Senator Arthur Vandenberg declared, in what became a favored metaphor, that there was a war on business. "We are close to the line where government expansion must stop, or our free enterprise system is lost," declared Senator Robert Taft in 1949. The idea that the hour is late for free enterprise was the premise of the famous Powell Memo of 1971, which described an attack on the American free enterprise system. Reagan, pondering a run for the presidency in 1974, claimed, much as Alf Landon had in 1936, that capitalism and free enterprise are under assault. In 1980, he won the presidency with much the same message, now increasingly popular, in spite of the manifest weakness of the putative assaulter, New Deal liberalism. If the free enterprise text from the 1920s through the 1980s remained remarkably stable, the context did not. The description New Deal order, applied retrospectively by historians to this era, imposes a stability that did not exist. Free enterprise language rarely changed, but its meaning and impact varied widely depending on circumstances. In spite of the frozenness of free enterprise discourse throughout the period from the election of Franklin Roosevelt through the election of Ronald Reagan, advocates responded flexibly and effectively to their changing roster of foes, from the New Deal to the height of post-war liberalism to the conservative turn in the age of Reagan, which it helped usher in. There was also cumulative power to this rhetoric, which led Powell's memo, published as the New Deal order was falling apart in 1971, to have a far greater real-world impact than the hundreds of eerily similar statements that had preceded it in the previous 4 decades. It is noteworthy that when the leadership of the Republican National Committee, RNC, launched a journal of thought and opinion in 1978, its founders chose to call it Common Sense, evoking not just Tom Paine's revolutionary tract, but the more recent conservative claims to the phrase as an antidote to an out-of-touch bureaucratic worldview that they associated with post-war liberalism. In the opening issue, the RNC chair, William Brock, called the battle between political parties a contest of ideas. But in keeping with what was at that moment a nearly 4-decade tradition of free enterprise common sense, Brock proposed no new ideas. Instead, he highlighted a very old one, a warning about the dangers of an activist federal government. In 1984, a Los Angeles Times correspondent described the new ideas celebrated by the Reagan-era party at the Republican convention as a thorough rejection of big government and an unbounded optimism about the nation's future. These were hardly new ideas. Rather, they were the essence of
Sample complete. Ready to continue?